Okay, so let's get going. We have 199 registered for today's webinar, so I hope most of you will join us live so we get a nice Q&A. This webinar is automatically captioned. You can show the captions by using the closed captions button, the CC button in Zoom. And there will be a short presentation followed by a Q&A. And if you do want to ask questions, which we of course encourage, do use the Q&A function for questions. And there will be links posted in the chat to the free smart guide that we always produce together with these webinars. So that is the setup of today. And we do pride ourselves with being on time. So we will stop at 2 o'clock Central European time, even if we have questions still to go. My name is Susanna Lorin, and I am going to be the presenter today on the European Accessibility Act and the additional requirements, or all requirements, but focusing on the requirements that people tend to forget in this legislation. I am the Managing Director and Chair of the Funka Foundation. I'm also the Chair of the ETSIS and Senelec e-Accessibility Joint Technical Body, which is the group responsible for making sure that we have European harmonized standards to go with the legislation on accessibility. And I'm also the IAAP and G3ICT representative to the EU. And IAAP is a member organization for accessibility experts, also certifying accessibility professionals. So that's a little bit about my background. And today I want to make a really short recap of the European Accessibility Act, and then talk about the requirements that normally is not the focus of the presentations we do, and normally also not the questions we get. And this has led us to believing that some parts of the legislation is a little bit confusing to people maybe, or just omitted. So I'm going to talk about maximizing the foreseeable use, which is kind of the heart of this legislation, and then providing information with more than one sensory channel, alternative to biometrics, allowing for flexible time for interaction, and also compatibility with assistive technology that are client-based, and then open up for questions in the end. So, the European Accessibility Act, I guess you have heard of it before. The scope of this act is not, as many people believe, private sector or commercial sector. The legislation doesn't care about what kind of status the economic operator has, but it covers the whole ecosystem. So manufacturers, authorized representatives, importers, distributors, and service providers of certain products and services that are offered to consumers in the EU. That is the scope of the legislation. So it doesn't matter if you are headquartered outside of the EU, or if you are commercial or not-for-profit. If you are under these umbrellas as the economic operators and provide the specific products and services covered, then you are in scope of this legislation. And the products covered are computers and operating systems, self-service terminals, ATMs, phones and smartphones, TV equipment for digital TV services, and e-readers. And on the service side, we have electronic communication, audiovisual media, the digital information, ticketing machines, and check-in machines, and so on, connected to transportation. So not the bus or train itself, but the digital information around it. Consumer banking, e-commerce, e-books, and emergency communication. So a rather wide scope. And of course, these products and services are selected to be the ones most important for people with disabilities, but it's not all products and services. It's just the selected ones that are covered. And I said that maximizing the foreseeable use was the heart of this legislation, and I think that is at least the kind of the keyword, because that is what the aim of this legislation is, to make sure that as many people as possible, no matter of their abilities, can use the product or service. So if you compare the Accessibility Act with the Web Accessibility Directive, they are quite different when it comes to the structure of the legislation or the legislative documents. In the Web Accessibility Directive, it is stated who is covered by the legislation and what is covered by the legislation, but everything around the specific requirements is pointed out in the EN 301-549 Annex A, so a harmonized standard. So you cannot really understand what does it mean to be accessible just by reading that directive. But in the European Accessibility Act, it's a bit different because it's the same. It's the what and the who and the what is stated, but also there are actual requirements in the law already. So in this directive, you have the generic requirements that covers all the products and services in scope. And then you have a section on products in scope and on services in scope. And then there is a chapter on the specific requirements for each of the product and service groups that are covered in the legislation. So there is much more hands-on specifications in the actual law than it was in the previous legislation. When technical specifications are needed, there is a long list of harmonized standards that are going to be acting as presumed conformance of the legislation. The key one, the most important one, is of course the EN 301-549, currently being updated and unfortunately delayed, so it will not be finished, the new update, until after the legislation has entered into force. This is of course a problem. And also a series of other standards that are either being updated or created from scratch. And I believe my colleague can post a link to a list of these standards covered in the mandate in the chat. It is, of course, a problem that the standards are not finished, finalized, and published before the legislation enters into force. But because the requirements are already in the law, that this doesn't mean that you cannot start to work on the compliance of your products and services. But it's not just the product or service in itself that needs to be accessible. There are also additional requirements, and this is what we try to highlight in this brief presentation. So in the requirements, there are also requirements on the information of on the use of the product and the functioning of the service. So the first part here is to use more than one sensory channel, or make sure that the information can be handled with more than one sensory channel. We would maybe call this multimodality, but in this legislation, it's the sensory channels way of expressing it. The idea is the same. Because we have people who cannot hear, we need to caption videos and audio and so on. You need to provide the information in more than one sensory channel. That's very basic and kind of the key or the essence for all accessibility requirements, and specifically important here. The information on the use of the product or how the service is functioning also needs to be understandable. So this is, of course, it should be natural and obvious, but this is also stated in the requirements that this information needs to be understandable by the users, and also presented in a way that users can perceive, which is, of course, aligned with other accessibility requirements and WCAG and so on. Then, in addition to this, the information needs to take into account the foreseeable conditions. And that means that users not only have different preferences or abilities, but also use your product or service in different environments or situations, on the run, in bright sunlight or whatever. So you need to take care of the size, spacing, contrast, and all of that when you present the information. So the list is much longer, of course, but these are kind of the highlights and where the most important grouping of requirements that we tend to present when we talk about the information. When it comes to the user interface and functionality, there is a requirement on providing an alternative to biometrics. And this is, of course, very important when it comes to verification, identification, authentication, and all of that. Biometrics can be a very good way of supporting people who have maybe problems with remembering passwords and so on. But of course, you need to provide an alternative because not everyone can use their fingertips or can use their eyes or whatever to identify themselves. So providing an alternative to biometrics is important, and kind of a way of providing information in more than one sensory channel, or providing multimodality, if you will. There's also a requirement on consistency, so the functionality should be possible to learn by the user, so that you can recognize and remember how to use things, and you don't have to relearn every part of the system, but you should provide the user interface and functionality must be made in a consistent way, and this is very kind of bordering to usability or good UX, of course. If there is some kind of interaction in this product or service, then you need to allow time, both flexibility for the user, if some users may need more time than others, but also enough time for interaction, which of course is individual. So this is in essence a requirement to allow for flexibility. And the user interface, of course, needs to be compatible with assistive technology, whether that be client-based or otherwise. There's also requirements for support services, and this is also very much in addition to the actual product or service that needs to be accessible. But if there is some kind of support services adjacent to your product or services, these also have requirements on accessibility. So the support service, it doesn't matter if that's it could be a human being, it could be an AI chatbot, it could be a document on a website, I don't know. But I mean, the support services can be many different things and have many different formats, but that needs to contain information on the accessibility of the product or service. So you can reach the information to understand about the features of the accessibility of the object in place. The support services as such need to be possible to reach with assistive technology. Should also be obvious, but it's not always the case. And it should also be provided in accessible modes of communication. So here we have a situation where the users may require or need or have preferences that are very, very different when it comes to communication, and the support services need to comply with that. Another kind of forgotten part of this legislation is the packaging of products, where the packaging in itself needs to be accessible. Also, the information about how to open, close, use, or dispose of the product needs to be provided and in an accessible format. And also information about the accessibility characteristics or features of of the product or services needs to be provided, the information of this either on the package or on an adjacent digital format in a website or app or such thing. All of this needs to be provided in an accessible way and on the package if it's feasible, or elsewhere, could be a website. Instructions on how to use the product or services also need to be accessible, of course, around information about installation, about maintenance, about storage, and about disposal. So all of this needs to be covered and also made accessible, and not only accessible, but possible to be generated in an alternative format. So this is again allowing for multimodality or preferences or user needs and abilities, making it useful with more than one sensory channel. So that's just a brief overview of the kind of the broadening of the scope or the broadening of the requirements that you need to take into account, and not only make sure that the product or service in scope itself is accessible, but really everything around. And I think this is what makes this legislation so interesting and really all encompassing. And again, the standards are not here yet, but they are also voluntary. If you want to make sure that you comply with the legislation and make sure that your product or services is maximizing the foreseeable use and become useful for everyone, including people with disabilities, then it's a good time to start now. And there's no reason not to start working on the accessibility just because we don't have the updated standards in place. It's also very clear that if you start with the current version of the EN 301549, adding WCAG 2.2, which will be included in the next update, then you will come a very long way, because none of these requirements will go away. So this is at least what you know is the baseline for the starting point for making your product or service accessible. So I have hit the 15 minutes. So thank you very much for listening. And we will move on to the questions. Please do use the Q&A function, because that's so much easier for me to see than if you do it in the chat. And let's see what I can find here. Okay, about the, it's a long question, but it's about the transitional measures. So it's true that the European Accessibility Act enters into force on the 28th of June in 2025, but there are transitional measures, and these are 4. There are two of them are in the Act, and 2 of them are optional for member states. So if we start with the ones that are actually in the directive, it's that member states shall provide a transitional period, or a grace period, if you will, for services that use products that were legal before the Accessibility Act entered into force. So then they can continue using that product for another maximum of 5 years. So until 2030, it's possible to use that product. And then you need to either make sure that the product is updated to meet the standards, or select another product. This is for products that are included in a service. Also, if you have a service contract that is agreed and signed before the law entered into place, you can continue to deliver on that service contract until it expires, but no longer than 5 years. So also 2030 as a maximum. Then the member state has an opt. There is a possibility to also provide a grace period for self-service terminals. So self-service terminals that have been in use before the legislation entered into force can be continued to be used for all of its economic life, but no longer than 20 years. And this is not 20 years after the laws got into place, but 20 years before the actual self-service terminal began to be in use. So if it's kind of still in use and it's still it's working as it should, so in its economical life, it can be used for another 20 years. And then about the emergency services, member states can also postpone the entering into force of the requirements for the emergency services until 2027. So those are the 4 grace periods that we have in the Act, and it will differ a little bit between member states as well. Next question: what are the best ways or tools to fix all my accessibility issues on my website? Oh my God, that's not an easy question to respond to. What's the best way or tools? I think there is a lot of good resources online. I would always encourage to look at all the IAAP material, of course, maybe become member of IAAP. You get a lot of knowledge and good tips there. Also, W3C has a lot of good free material out there. So there's quite a lot of knowledge on the market that you don't have to pay for even. So that's a good way to start, but you need to learn. And I think that kind of the training or building competence is always important, because even if you have the money to buy services from an external supplier or an expert, you will kind of then be completely dependent on that expert, and it can be really hard to procure or buy new products and services. So I think just building competence and knowledge, you need to start learning, read the standards, and ask for help when needed, but really, I think it's really about training yourself or your staff or your team to doing this. There is no magic bullet. There is no tool. There is no kind of I click this or I buy this and then it's magically happening. You need to work with suppliers and developers and designers and content creators that know what they're doing. It is a question of competence. That is there's no quick fix. I'm sorry. Maybe in the future AI will solve everything, but as of today we don't have that really. The next question is, why do you say that law why does it cover also how can the EU create, I think this is the interpretation of this, is how the EU can create laws that cover other parts of the world. Of course we can't. We the European Commission, the EU cannot develop laws that enters into force outside of the EU. That is not an issue. But the EU is an inner market, and if somebody from the outside wants to sell their products and services in this inner market, then that is the jurisdiction of the European Union, and the EU can decide that we don't want inaccessible products here. So that is the kind of the logic of it. I'm not a lawyer, so I cannot explain legal issues in a very legalistic way, but that is kind of the logic here, that we can only make laws around our own market. And I think that's kind of the layman explanation to that. Is it enough to cover WCAG? No, it's not enough. I mean, clearly not enough, because the Accessibility Act covers much more than websites, which I think was kind of the topic of today. But WCAG is a global standard, and it's the baseline of most accessibility standards and so on. But in the EU legislation cannot point to global or international standards. We can only point to our own harmonized European standards, so-called EN, European norms. And that means that it's the EN 301-549, the kind of the main ICT product and service standard, accessibility standard that we have in the EU. And there, the WCAG is kind of included or referenced there, but there are also additional standards, additional requirements. And already now, that current version that is acting as presumed conformance to the Web Accessibility Directive, in Annex A, we have requirements that go beyond WCAG. I think it's 30 or so additional requirements that are not from WCAG. So we have WCAG in the standard, but we go beyond and we do more than that. And that will be even more clear for the European Accessibility Act, as we have the EN updated. And then we have the Design for All standard 17161, which has nothing to do with WCAG. And we have the Built Environment standard 17210. And then we have the standards on support services, non-digital information, and emergency communication as well. So there are quite a lot of things that go beyond WCAG. That said, WCAG is a very good place to start. And again, the updated version of the EN 301-549 will include WCAG 2.2. So that's kind of the level. If you are in the ecosystem of W3C, then 2.2 is the level that the European legislation will be pointing at as well. Things are happening in the chat as well. This is always a problem for me. What exactly does standards are voluntary mean? Are there some requirements that you presented that are not mandatory to implement? So what I was presenting was from the Act. So everything I've been saying today is stated in Annex 1 of the European Accessibility Act. So I'm talking about requirements in the law. The standards are not the law. It's not the same thing. Even when they are harmonized, they act as presumed conformance, which means they are a support for industry. and a way to present the technical specifications. But if you can show that you meet the requirements in the Act in another way, you are welcome to solve that issue or create a solution that does it in another way, as long as you meet the requirements. So the legal requirements are in the law. The standards contain the technical specifications and a support and a help and a way for you to make sure that you comply, but it's possible to comply in other ways as well. This is a way to foster innovation and make sure that market players can innovate and do other things. It's also kind of smart because legislation takes very long time. Standards also take a long time, but it's much faster than a legislative process. So we have the possibility to update the standards when we keep the law. And that's kind of the way the European system works. So that is what I mean when I say standards are voluntary. They are voluntary. But when they are published and harmonized, that means that they are officially published in what is called the European Union Official Journal. And that means that you can point to them and say, hey, I meet this standard. And that way you can be quite sure that you are in compliance with the legislation. So it's kind of a safety net or a good way forward to ensure compliance. For the EN 301549, is there a resource that you would recommend that is written in layman's terms? No. Oh, I get this question so often. Unfortunately not. I wish I could say yes, there is a very good source. We did together with Microsoft a couple of years ago a video series on the EN, and I cannot promise, but I hope that we will get funding to doing another version of that. So fingers crossed, there will soon be a video series on understanding the EN 301549. I haven't seen the contract yet, but it's on its way. Should happen and is really important. People working in standards do not like to rewrite standards in layman's terms, and that may sound cheeky or kind of evil. It's not. It's just that as soon as you start trying to transform or translate into kind of human language, you risk entering into problems, and especially when this is so closely connected to legislation, nobody wants to say, oh no, I told them to do this and that's supposed to be okay, and then they got a penalty for this. This is not good. On yesterday's webinar, we're referring to what I've said in other webinars, you mentioned that you don't see the European Accessibility Act to be adapted in the near future. Well, I think we talked about adding new services, and the EN 301549 is based on WCAG 2.2. What will happen when WCAG 3.0 comes out in a few years? Will the European Accessibility Act or EN standard become outdated? Well, I wouldn't say that a law becomes outdated just because a standard is evolving. But of course, if WCAG 3.0 becomes published and is a stable standard that the European Commission thinks can be useful in Europe, and then they can issue a new mandate and tell the European standardization organizations that they should now create a new version, do a review, and add the WCAG 3.0 in that. But we also know that 3.0 may kind of change the whole idea of how to measure compliance and so on. So maybe it may be that it doesn't really fit, or it may be that it needs to be rewritten to fit with the European way of doing legislation. I mean, we really don't know. But the idea of separating legislation and standard is that the standards should be possible to review and update quicker than the legislation. So that's, I think, is the response to that. Okay, so now it's 2 o'clock and we need to end this. So if I can ask Stefan to provide the link to the smart guide that we have created, or not me, but my super nice designers and UX designers. I will just finalize by promoting the next Friday webinar, which is in 2 weeks, the 13th of September, same time. And we will talk about internal systems and accessibility in design tools. And it will be my colleague, Stefan Pelk and Tine Persson, who will be presenting at that time. And I believe that webinar will be in Swedish. So you can, if you are not Swedish speaking, you can train yourself in this webinar. Thank you very much for listening today. Have a nice rest of your Friday. Bye-bye.